The history of World War II is filled with stories of rivalry, jealousy, and personal animosity between commanders who were supposed to be on the same side. But few relationships were as complex and ultimately as bitter as the one between General Omar Bradley and General George Patton. On the surface, they were fellow American generals, fighting the same enemy, colleagues who had known each other for years, men who should have been united in common purpose. Yet beneath this surface lay resentment so deep that Bradley, even decades after the war ended, even after both men had secured their places in history, refused to forgive Patton for actions that had occurred during their service together. Today, we're going to explore what created this lasting bitterness and why Bradley carried these grievances to his grave. To understand the depth of Bradley's resentment toward Patton, we need to understand how different these two men were in temperament, background, and philosophy. Omar Bradley was the son of a Missouri schoolteacher, a man who rose through the ranks through competence, reliability, and an understated leadership style that earned him the nickname the GI's General. He was methodical, careful with the lives of his men, and deeply uncomfortable with self-promotion or grandstanding. Bradley represented a certain type of American military leadership that valued professionalism over personality, substance over style, results over rhetoric. George Patton, in contrast, came from wealth and privilege. His family had military traditions going back generations. He was flamboyant, quotable, and absolutely convinced of his own genius. Where Bradley was careful, Patton was reckless. Where Bradley avoided the spotlight, Patton sought it out. Where Bradley measured success in objectives achieved with minimal casualties, Patton measured success in miles advanced and enemies destroyed, regardless of the cost. These fundamental differences in personality and approach would have created friction under any circumstances. But the specific events of World War II turned that friction into something far more corrosive. The relationship between Bradley and Patton began long before World War II. They had known each other since the 1920s, serving together at various posts during the long, slow peacetime years between the wars. In those early days, their relationship was cordial, if not particularly close. Patton was senior to Bradley in date of rank, and in the rigid hierarchy of the peacetime army, that meant something. Bradley respected Patton's knowledge of armored warfare and his passionate advocacy for mechanization. Patton saw Bradley as a competent staff officer, reliable but unremarkable. When World War II began and both men found themselves in North Africa, their positions relative to each other started to shift in ways that would plant the seeds of future resentment. Patton initially commanded the Western Task Force in the invasion of North Africa, and later took command of 2nd Corps after its disastrous performance at Kasserine Pass. He revitalized the Corps with his aggressive leadership and strict discipline. Bradley served under Patton during this period as Deputy Corps Commander, watching and learning Patton's methods. When Patton was elevated to command 7th Army for the invasion of Sicily, Bradley was promoted to command 2nd Corps, now serving under Patton, but in command of a substantial force. The Sicily campaign was where the first serious cracks in their relationship appeared. Patton and British General Bernard Montgomery were both given roles in the invasion, but Montgomery's 8th Army was clearly intended to have the starring role, driving up the east coast of Sicily to capture Messina, while Patton's 7th Army protected Montgomery's flank. Patton, never one to accept a supporting role gracefully, became obsessed with beating Montgomery to Messina. He saw the campaign not just as a military operation, but as a competition, a chance to prove that American forces were equal or superior to the British. Bradley commanded Second Corps, which was doing the actual hard fighting, pushing through difficult terrain against determined German resistance. Meanwhile, Patton was focused on a spectacular end run around the coast, racing to Messina ahead of the British. Bradley felt that Patton was more interested in headlines than in sound military strategy. The resources that could have supported Bradley's difficult advance through the center of Sicily were being diverted to Patton's coastal drive. Men were dying in the mountains, while Patton was positioning himself for a photo opportunity in Messina. What made this situation particularly galling for Bradley was that Patton got exactly what he wanted. 7th Army reached Messina first, and Patton was photographed triumphantly entering the city, beating the British and securing headlines around the world. But Bradley knew the truth. The real fighting, the difficult work of breaking German defensive positions, had been done by his corps, while Patton had essentially taken a victory lap. This was Bradley's first real taste of what he saw as Patton's shameless self-promotion at the expense of the men doing the actual fighting. Then came the slapping incidents. In August 1943, while visiting field hospitals in Sicily, Patton encountered soldiers suffering from what we would now call post-traumatic stress disorder. In 2 separate incidents, Patton slapped these soldiers, called them cowards, and threatened them. When news of these incidents broke, it created an enormous scandal. Bradley's reaction to the slapping incidents reveals a lot about his character and his growing disillusionment with Patton. He was disgusted by Patton's behavior, seeing it as not just cruel, but as a betrayal of the soldiers who were fighting under his command. For Bradley, who genuinely cared about the welfare of his troops, Patton's treatment of these psychologically wounded men was unforgivable. But what may have bothered Bradley even more was what happened after the slapping incidents became public. Patton was essentially sidelined, kept out of combat commands during the crucial early months after D-Day as punishment for his actions. This meant that Bradley, who had been Patton's subordinate in Sicily, was now his superior. Bradley was given command of 1st Army for the D-Day invasion and later command of 12th Army Group, making him one of the senior American commanders in Europe. Patton, when he finally returned to combat command, would now be serving under Bradley. This reversal of their positions created a dynamic that neither man found comfortable. For Bradley, it was validation that competence and professionalism mattered more than flamboyance and publicity. For Patton, it was a humiliation that he could barely conceal. He now had to take orders from a man he had always considered his inferior, someone he had once commanded. Patton's letters and diary entries from this period drip with contempt for Bradley, whom he saw as plodding, overcautious, and lacking in killer instinct. When Patton's 3rd Army became operational in August 1944, following the breakout from Normandy, the tension between the two men intensified dramatically. Patton's army executed one of the most spectacular advances in military history, racing across France and liberating vast territories in a matter of weeks. Patton was back in the headlines, being celebrated as America's most aggressive and successful field commander. But he was also being supplied and supported by Bradley's 12th Army Group, and Bradley controlled how much fuel, ammunition, and other supplies Patton received. This is where things became truly bitter. Patton was convinced that Bradley was deliberately throttling his advance out of jealousy and timidity. Every time supplies ran short, every time Patton was told to slow down or halt to let supply lines catch up, he blamed Bradley personally. He accused Bradley of being more concerned with Montgomery and the British than with supporting American armies. He suggested that Bradley lacked the vision to see that Third Army could end the war quickly if only given adequate support. These accusations, made both privately to his staff and in carefully phrased comments to war correspondents, inevitably got back to Bradley. From Bradley's perspective, Patton's complaints were not just unfair, but delusional. Bradley was managing multiple armies, all of which needed supplies that were in desperately short supply. The logistics system was stretched to the breaking point. Every gallon of fuel given to Patton was a gallon that couldn't go to First Army or Ninth Army. Bradley was trying to maintain a balanced advance along a broad front, as Eisenhower had directed, while Patton wanted all resources concentrated on his single army for a narrow thrust. Bradley saw Patton's attitude as fundamentally selfish, caring more about his own glory than about the overall success of Allied operations. The dispute over supplies and strategy in autumn 1944 created lasting damage to their relationship. Bradley felt that Patton was undermining his authority, going over his head to Eisenhower, complaining to anyone who would listen that Bradley's caution was prolonging the war. Patton felt that Bradley was a mediocre commander who had been promoted beyond his abilities and was now preventing more talented generals from winning the war. Each man had evidence to support his view, and neither was willing to see the situation from the other's perspective. Then came the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944, and with it, the incident that Bradley would never forgive. When the Germans launched their surprise offensive through the Ardennes, they created a bulge in the American lines that threatened to split Bradley's army group in two. The northern shoulder of the bulge was held by First Army, while the southern shoulder was held by Third Army. Bradley's headquarters was south of the bulge, making communication with First Army difficult. Eisenhower made a command decision that would enrage Bradley for the rest of his life. Eisenhower temporarily transferred First Army from Bradley's command to Montgomery's 21st Army Group. The reasoning was sound from a military standpoint. Montgomery's headquarters had better communications with First Army's positions, and having a single commander responsible for the northern shoulder of the bulge made tactical sense. But for Bradley, this was a devastating blow to his prestige and authority. He was being, as he saw it, demoted in the middle of a crisis, with half his command being given to Montgomery, the British general whom many Americans had come to resent for his cautious approach and tendency to claim credit for American achievements. Bradley pleaded with Eisenhower to reconsider, arguing that the command change was unnecessary and would be seen as a lack of confidence in American leadership. Eisenhower overruled him. The command change was made, and Montgomery, true to form, held a press conference in which he implied that he had been called in to rescue the situation from American mismanagement. This press conference created an uproar in the American press and among American commanders. Bradley was humiliated, and he blamed not just Montgomery and Eisenhower, but also Patton. Why did Bradley blame Patton for this? Because during the crisis, when Eisenhower was deciding how to reorganize the command structure, Patton had not stood up for Bradley. Patton had been more interested in getting permission to launch his own counterattack than in defending his superior's command prerogatives. In fact, some evidence suggests that Patton was quietly pleased by Bradley's humiliation, seeing it as evidence that Bradley had never been qualified for Army Group Command in the first place. Bradley knew this, or at least suspected it, and he never forgot it. Patton's relief of Bastogne, his famous 90-degree turn of Third Army to strike the German flank, was militarily brilliant and helped turn the tide of the battle. But for Bradley, Patton's heroics were overshadowed by what he saw as Patton's disloyalty during Bradley's moment of crisis. A true colleague, Bradley felt, would have supported him with Eisenhower, would have argued against the command change, would have shown some loyalty to the man who was, after all, his superior officer. Instead, Patton had thought only of his own opportunity for glory. As the Battle of the Bulge wound down and First Army was returned to Bradley's command, the relationship between Bradley and Patton was permanently poisoned. They communicated when necessary, coordinated their operations as required, but the personal relationship was essentially over. Bradley saw Patton as a self-promoting glory hound who would sacrifice anyone, including former comrades, for his own advancement. Patton saw Bradley as a mediocre plotter who had been lucky enough to serve under competent commanders and had somehow blundered his way into high command. The final months of the war saw continued friction over strategy and resources. Patton wanted to drive deep into Germany, potentially all the way to Berlin or Prague. Bradley, following Eisenhower's directives, favored a more methodical approach focused on destroying German forces rather than capturing symbolic objectives. Every time Bradley overruled Patton or denied him resources for one of his proposed operations, Patton would complain about Bradley's lack of vision and aggressive spirit. Every time Patton exceeded his authority or bent the rules to continue advancing, Bradley would have to reprimand him, further straining their relationship. One incident that particularly enraged Bradley occurred near the end of the war, when Patton's forces were approaching Czechoslovakia. Patton desperately wanted to liberate Prague before the Soviets could reach it. Bradley, under orders from Eisenhower, instructed Patton not to advance beyond a certain line. Patton argued, cajoled, and came very close to simply disobeying the order. Bradley had to issue a direct, unambiguous command to stop Patton from creating an international incident by clashing with Soviet forces. That Patton even considered disobeying such a clear order was, for Bradley, evidence of how little Patton respected his authority. After the war ended, Bradley might have hoped that the personal animosities would fade with time and distance. Instead, they intensified. Patton, in his final months before his death in December 1945, was openly critical of occupation policies that Bradley supported. More importantly, Patton was already starting to work on his memoirs and giving interviews in which he presented his version of events, a version that was often highly critical of other commanders, including Bradley. Bradley was aware of this and deeply resented that Patton was rewriting history to make himself look better at the expense of others. Patton's death in December 1945 might have ended the rivalry, but instead it complicated Bradley's feelings even further. The public memory of Patton, shaped by admiring journalists and eventually by Hollywood, became that of a brilliant, aggressive warrior who had been held back by more cautious commanders. Bradley found himself implicitly criticized in this narrative. He was the careful, methodical commander who had supposedly lacked Patton's vision and daring. The fact that Bradley had actually been Patton's superior for most of the war got lost in the mythology. When Bradley wrote his own memoirs, A Soldier's Story, published in 1951, his treatment of Patton revealed the depth of his unresolved feelings. Bradley praised Patton's tactical abilities and acknowledged his contributions to victory. But he also made clear his view that Patton was difficult, insubordinate, and often more concerned with personal glory than with the mission. Bradley's assessment was measured and fair in many ways, but you can feel the underlying resentment in how he describes their interactions. What really showed that Bradley had not forgiven Patton was his reaction to the 1970 film Patton, starring George C. Scott. The film, which won the Academy Award for Best Picture, presented Patton as a complex but ultimately heroic figure, a military genius held back by lesser men. Bradley, who was still alive and serving as a military advisor on the film, was reportedly unhappy with how the film portrayed the command relationships. He felt that it perpetuated the myth of Patton as an unappreciated genius, rather than showing the reality of a talented but deeply flawed commander who created constant problems for his superiors. In interviews late in his life, Bradley was asked repeatedly about Patton. His answers were always carefully calibrated. He would acknowledge Patton's abilities, but would also make sure to note his flaws. He would credit Patton's achievements, but would also point out that Patton had not operated in a vacuum, that his successes were made possible by the support and resources provided by the larger command structure. There was never a moment where Bradley said something like, "I was wrong about Patton," or "I wish we had been closer." The resentment, muted by time and professional courtesy, was still there. So what exactly did Bradley refuse to forgive Patton for? It wasn't any single incident, but rather a pattern of behavior that Bradley found inexcusable. First was Patton's treatment of his troops, exemplified by the slapping incidents but extending to his general attitude that soldiers were expendable resources to be used for achieving objectives. Bradley, who saw himself as a commander who carefully weighed the cost of operations in human lives, found Patton's casualness about casualties to be morally offensive. Second was Patton's shameless self-promotion and his willingness to take credit for achievements that were the result of collective effort. Bradley had watched Patton angle for publicity, court war correspondence, and position himself for maximum media exposure throughout the war. For a man like Bradley, who believed that the work should speak for itself, Patton's constant self-aggrandizement was deeply distasteful. It wasn't just that Patton promoted himself, it was that he did so at the expense of others, including Bradley. Third was Patton's repeated insubordination and his tendency to interpret orders in whatever way best suited his desire to keep attacking. Bradley had to deal with Patton bending rules, exceeding his authority, and sometimes coming close to outright disobedience. For a professional soldier like Bradley, who believed in the chain of command and military discipline, Patton's behavior was not just annoying but fundamentally wrong. That Patton got away with it because of his success only made it more galling. Fourth, and perhaps most unforgivable, was what Bradley saw as Patton's disloyalty during the Battle of the Bulge. When Bradley's command authority was being questioned and diminished, Patton had not stood with him. In Bradley's code of professional conduct, you supported your colleagues and fellow commanders, especially in front of others, and especially during crises. Patton's failure to do this, his apparent pleasure in Bradley's discomfort, was a betrayal that Bradley could not forget. Finally, there was the accumulated weight of small slights, dismissive comments, and barely concealed contempt that Patton had shown Bradley throughout their service together. Patton had never really accepted Bradley as his superior. His letters and diary entries, which became public after his death, were filled with disparaging comments about Bradley's abilities and character. Bradley knew that Patton had never respected him, had always considered himself the better commander unfairly subordinated to a lesser man. This knowledge, this certainty, that Patton had looked down on him, was something Bradley never got past. The tragedy of the Bradley-Patton relationship is that both men were right about each other in some ways and wrong in others. Bradley was right that Patton was difficult, insubordinate, and often reckless with the lives of his men. He was right that Patton was a shameless self-promoter who rewrote history to make himself look better. He was right that Patton's tactical brilliance was often bought at a high price in casualties and logistical chaos. But Bradley was perhaps wrong to let these flaws blind him to Patton's genuine contributions and to the ways in which Patton's aggressive spirit achieved results that Bradley's more methodical approach might not have achieved. Patton was right that Bradley was sometimes overcautious, that his broad front strategy prolonged the war, and that opportunities were missed because of excessive concern with supply lines and maintaining tidy front lines. He was right that Bradley lacked the killer instinct that drove Patton to pursue beaten enemies relentlessly. But Patton was wrong to dismiss Bradley as merely lucky, or to fail to appreciate the enormous complexity of commanding an army group and balancing competing demands for limited resources. The question of whether Bradley should have forgiven Patton is complicated by the fact that forgiveness requires some acknowledgement of wrong from the person being forgiven. Patton never acknowledged that he had wronged Bradley. In Patton's view, he had simply been a superior commander frustrated by the limitations of his superiors. He never apologized for his contempt, his insubordination, or his disloyalty. How can you forgive someone who never admits they did anything wrong? Moreover, Bradley's inability to forgive Patton reflects something deeper than personal animosity. It reflects fundamentally different philosophies about military leadership and the responsibilities of command. Bradley believed that commanders had a sacred trust to accomplish their missions while preserving the lives of their men to the greatest extent possible. He believed in professionalism, discipline, and subordination of personal glory to collective achievement. He believed in loyalty to colleagues and to the chain of command. Patton believed that victory was the only thing that mattered, that history judged commanders by whether they won or lost, not by their personal comportment or their consideration for their subordinates. He believed that aggressive action and personal initiative were more important than following rules or maintaining neat organizational charts. He believed that loyalty to the mission superseded loyalty to individuals who might be impeding that mission. These are not just different styles, but different value systems. And Bradley could no more forgive Patton's value system than Patton could adopt Bradley's. What Bradley refused to forgive was not just specific actions, but Patton's entire approach to command and his attitude toward the profession of arms. For Bradley, Patton represented everything wrong with a certain type of military leadership that prioritized personal glory over professional excellence, that treated soldiers as pawns rather than as human beings, that saw war as an opportunity for individual heroism rather than as a collective endeavor requiring cooperation and mutual support. In the final analysis, Bradley's refusal to forgive Patton, even after victory, even after death, tells us as much about Bradley as it does about Patton. It reveals Bradley as a man of firm principles, who could not simply forget when those principles were violated. It shows him as someone who valued loyalty and professional conduct more than tactical brilliance. It demonstrates that for Bradley, how you achieved victory mattered almost as much as whether you achieved it. History has rendered its own verdict on both men. Both are considered great commanders of World War II, each in their own way. Patton is remembered as the more colorful personality, the subject of films and endless fascination. Bradley is remembered as the steady, reliable professional, less glamorous, but equally important to victory. Their relationship, characterized by resentment and ultimately by Bradley's refusal to forgive, reminds us that even on the winning side, even among men fighting the same enemy, personal relationships and conflicting values can create wounds that never fully heal. The fact that Bradley carried his grievances against Patton to the end of his life, that he never found it in himself to forgive or even to move past his resentment, is not a character flaw, so much as evidence of how deeply Patton's behavior violated Bradley's sense of how commanders should act. For Bradley, forgiving Patton would have meant accepting that Patton's approach was legitimate, that personal glory-seeking and disregard for professional norms were acceptable if they led to tactical success. Bradley could not and would not accept that, not even after both men had secured their places in history, not even after victory had vindicated both their contributions to winning the war.